It's important to say that this story is not in any way rooted in historical fact. Houston, we had a problem. You probably wouldn't keep a sniper like that in a church tower. Love this speech, but it's nonsense. It's word salad. Hi, I'm Dan Snow. This is the big one. I'm reviewing the 5 greatest historical movies of all time as voted for by you. Oh, Gladiator, such a good movie. So historically inaccurate, but who cares? This scene's very powerful. Commodus was indeed a poor emperor of Rome, megalomaniac, inherited from his father Marcus Aurelius. No evidence that he killed his father. And in fact, no evidence that his father didn't want him to rule after him because his father had actually raised him up and sort of anointed him as an heir. Commodus shockingly did enter the arena as a gladiator, which was shocking for an emperor, because gladiators were traditionally slaves and prisoners of war.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of
Now it's possible, I don't know this, but it's possible that Russell Crowe mispronounces Maximus Decimus Meridius. It could be that Meridus, meaning from someone from Merida in Spain, but sounds cool.
General of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
Love this speech, but it's nonsense. It's word salad. There was a Felix Legion. One of the legions was known as the Felix, the Lucky Legion, particularly served under the Emperor Vespasian, but there was no general of the Felix Legions. And there wasn't really commander of the armies of the north at this point in the Roman Empire. You see the Praetorian Guard here. The Praetorian Guard are absolutely part of Roman history from this point. They're a bodyguard to the emperor, but in fact they're a cause of great instability. They require constant bribing. They assassinated emperors. They auctioned off the emperorship at one point to the highest bidder. They dressed in purple. They're seen as an elite bodyguard, but they're just frankly a bunch of troublemakers. They spend more time killing emperors than saving their lives. And this bit shows the famous thumbs up or thumbs down for gladiators. It is true that people could show mercy. It's now thought that thumbs up meant kill. To keep, to use your sword, to thrust your sword. Thumbs down actually meant to sheathe your weapon. But the filmmakers decided that we're more familiar with thumbs up being positive, so they just went with the thumbs up, meaning spare the gladiator. I think the film also does accurately portray the amphitheatre, the games, as an important part of Roman life. The Roman emperors would put on games and distractions to keep the crowd happy, to make the people of Rome admire them, to bolster their rule. And they'd hand out free bread at these things as well. So games and what went on at the Colosseums were a powerful method of control in the Roman capital.
We're finally going back to where we belong. The Colosseum.
Wonderful scene, this great bit of acting by Ollie Reed. Proximo is a kind of Rudiarus. That's a former gladiator who's been given his freedom, fought so many fights that he eventually is freed. And in this film, it said that Marcus Aurelius himself freed him. He gave him a wooden sword, and that was the Rudius. Was a wooden sword that was handed out.
Silence before you strike, and the noise afterwards. It rises up like.
And he explains to Maximus how he can win his freedom. Because you are a slave. Gladiators are slaves, or captured prisoners of war or slaves. They had no control over their destiny. They could be slaughtered in the Colosseum, in the arena at any time. His only way of freedom is to become a celebrity, to become a great gladiator, win all his fights, and go on and be given his liberty.
A symbol of your freedom.
There you go. There you see the wooden sword, given to all former gladiators who managed to survive the grueling, appalling experience that was fighting in the arena. Sometimes the emperor would give a wooden sword out himself, but not all the time.
I wasn't the best because I killed quickly. I was the best because the crowd loved me.
And Proximo is right, it was showmanship. This was entertainment in Rome, bloody entertainment. It is accurate to say that Marcus Aurelius had banned gladiatorial combat in Rome. It was reintroduced by Commodus, his son. Gladiator is a powerful, wonderful film, but it's pretty much fantasy. Rome, as it's shown, didn't really look like that. The story didn't happen. Commodus was not killed by a gladiator in the arena. The Republic was not restored at the end. It is a wonderful story, but a crazy one. However, I think elements of it give you a sense of what life was like in the Roman Empire, and as a depiction of gladiatorial life and training and the conditions in which they kept, I think it's really interesting. Fantastic. Again, we've seen space movies more recently, but this is just a fantastic depiction of space travel. And at the time was groundbreaking. They go through a routine procedure and a tiny, tiny fault causes a small explosion. This is the big moment. You see them talking to their ground control, which is in Houston, in Texas.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
This is one of the great lines, one of the great moments in Hollywood history. Tom Hanks playing Jim Lovell says, "Houston, we got a problem." And in fact, the line was, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." And that actually came from Swigert. He was the first to tell Houston about the problem.
Yes. We've got a big light. Fire doesn't make any sense. We've got multiple caution and warning, Houston. We've got to reset.
One key inaccuracy in the movie is that there is some drama, there's some tension between Lovell and Swigert. That one appears to blame the other for the accident. In reality, apparently that did not happen. There wasn't friction between the crew members.
Flight GNC? Flight, they're all over the place. They keep yawing close to gimbal lock.
I keep losing radio signal. Flight, their antenna must be
22. They're gonna have to do it manually if they do.
Now, there's Mission Control. That's in Houston, Texas. That set is kind of perfect, almost down to the last detail. They wanted to film it in the original Mission Control, but it's now a historic landmark and they couldn't risk filming in there and it's a bit too small. And so they kind of rebuilt it and took precise measurements and replicated it in a set. So it looks perfect.
Look, I know this sequence works, John.
The sequence looks good. We're just over budget on the amperage.
By how much?
3 or 4 amps.
God damn.
So you see Ken Mattingly in this scene. Now, he was supposed to be on the Apollo 13 mission, but he was exposed to German measles before he went. And again, I think the movie's a little bit unfair here. The surgeon is presented as a bit of like a risk-averse guy, but actually measles was incredibly serious at the time. And had he developed measles, it would have put all of their lives in extreme jeopardy. So Apollo 13 was the 7th crewed mission in the Apollo space program. It was the 3rd that was meant to land on the moon. It launched on the 11th of April 1970 from Kennedy in Florida. And then, spookily, on April the 13th, there was a fault. There was an explosion. I've interviewed an astronaut who said they give it an 8 out of 10 for accuracy. That's high praise coming from him. They go as far as trying to use original transcripts. They film some scenes in the so-called Vomit Comet, an aircraft that replicates the effect of zero gravity. It is based on Apollo 13 Commander Jim Lovell's book, Lost Moon. It is an account of what happened when that mission fell apart. Lovell was really pleased with the movie. He actually said, it's amazing, the instrument panels, the consoles, that's exactly what things look like inside that spacecraft. Apollo 13 is an extraordinary movie because you know how it ends. Everyone knows they survive, and yet they build tension so effectively. It is a brilliant depiction of space travel. It's a brilliant depiction of the teamwork, the professionalism, the expertise required to send human beings to the moon. Unimaginable with the technology they had available to them at the time. And it's also just a brilliant bit of acting. You really root for these guys and are thrilled when they land safely. They splash down back on Earth. This is an incredibly powerful scene showing the type of warfare that the Brits had to master if they were going to survive in North America. And it shows just how bad they were at it initially. In a world of shifting loyalties, this suggests that Magua was their Huron guide. He turns against them, he leads them into an ambush. The superior fighting skills of the indigenous people are on display. The British attempt to line up and fight as they would on the European battlefield, firing volleys of muskets, front rank kneeling, ranks behind them standing, and in a heavily wooded landscape like North America, that's completely inappropriate. It's easy to take cover behind trees and logs, hide in the folds of the landscape, and then take advantage of the time spent reloading to attack at close quarters with tomahawk, bayonet, knife. You see a British unit cut to pieces here. This did happen in the French-Indian War, the 7 Years' War in North America. Some units were absolutely annihilated in the irregular fighting that you get in woods like this. But you look at those red coats, they're wearing heavy red woolen coats, far too hot in the summer, not warm enough in the winter. The Brits weren't properly equipped, they weren't trained for this kind of warfare. The indigenous Americans are shown masters of hand-to-hand fighting. I think they would have been hugely effective. Scalping there, that was a practice that went on. This shows the confusion of fighting on the frontier. There would have been countless episodes like this, militia fighting indigenous groups, war bands, stumbling across each other, ambushing each other. And here comes Hawkeye, his adopted father and brother. Supremely good warriors. Hawkeye, played by Daniel Day-Lewis in one of their great performances. Can't believe he didn't win an Oscar award for this one. I like this scene a lot because he does describe the terrible bind that the Huron, the indigenous people of the Americas, have been in ever since Europeans first landed on the continent. He is trying to balance the needs of diplomacy, of statesmanship, of the anger of his young men to make war, to expand their power within North America, but also not to inflame tensions with Europeans, the French, the Brits, the American colonists, who are all jostling for power in North America at this time. As Magua says, indigenous American groups are fighting between themselves for primacy. The Huron, who this represents, are a tribe who live in modern-day Ontario, probably sort of north of the Great Lakes, and they're bitter enemies of the Iroquois Confederacy, which are further south in sort of parts of modern-day New York and Pennsylvania. And they have an ongoing generational struggle with each other. That is aided by the fact that the Iroquois, particularly the Mohawks, support, on the whole, the British, the American colonists, and the Huron are sort of allied with French colonists in Canada.
Those are the ways of the Yengeese and the Francais traders, and their masters in Europe infected with the sickness of greed.
So the Huron chief is constantly trying to balance the interests of his tribe, the competition with other indigenous groups, and the competition with the new arrivals, the British and the French.
Go free. This belt, which is a record of the days of my father's people, speaks for my truth.
It is true that they would have debated what to do with prisoners, and sometimes prisoners were put to death in agonizing ways, other times they were released. And I think also this scene is very clever because it talks about the role of Magua, the ambition of young men. The chiefs were not absolute rulers. They couldn't just command and be obeyed. And there were splinter groups within these tribes, as there were within British and French society, of often ambitious, aggressive young men that would disobey their chief and go and conduct raids and attacks on other groups and inflame situations. So these chiefs had to manage very difficult, very volatile situations. It's a great moment. 2 British women and a British officer have been captured, and Hawkeye enters this Huron village to try and bargain, try to convince the Huron to release them. In the end, the British officer sacrificed himself for a woman he loves, but did not love him. It's important to say that this story is not in any way rooted in historical fact. It's just inspired by a particular period of American colonial history. Master Mohicans is a made-up story, so it's inaccurate in that respect, but it is a superb vision of warfare, of life, of death on the frontier in the 1750s. The shifting alliances between indigenous groups, France and Britain, as they sought to carve out empires in the New World. It's a beautifully shot film. The costumes, the landscapes, the tools, all take us back to the 1750s and give us a wonderful depiction of what life and death was like.
And so on. Left side, Ghetto B. Surplus labor. The elderly and infirm mostly. Which is where you will want to start, huh?
Untersturmführer Amon Goeth, who even by the standards of the Holocaust is one of the most evil, sadistic, psychopathic SS camp commanders.
Segregated, of course. The men in the barracks near the quarry, the women on the other side of the wire.
My place is where?
There, sir.
Where?
Yes, the villa.
You call that a villa?
The synagogue, can you
These
see?
concentration camps were places where Jews, but other persecuted minorities as well, were housed in appalling conditions, given barely enough food to survive, sometimes less food than they needed to survive, and forced to carry out slave labour. Many were sent from camps like this to death camps, where they were industrially slaughtered. But at places like this, the emphasis would be on work, on inflicting suffering and humiliation. And even though they weren't designed as death camps, life expectancy could be measured in a matter of weeks.
From all this backbreaking work at my new villa. Which of you has domestic experience?
In this bit, we see him selecting a kind of a maid, a servant, from among the Jews, and this is based on a real character. She would go on to work for Schindler. And there's the suggestion here, although we don't see it, that many of these women would enter sexual slavery as well, as the SS camp guards and officials would select women from among the inmates in the camp.
She says the foundation was poured wrong. She's got to take it down. I told her the barracks at the
You see people being put to work in these camps. They built very, very fragile accommodation that was insufficient to keep people alive and warm through the winter. And then you see the punishment meted out to anyone who dared complain or stand up to the authorities.
Of the barracks, subsidence, and then collapse.
You are an engineer?
Yes. My name is Diana Reiter. I'm a graduate of civil engineering from the University of Milan.
Oh, I'm educated Jew.
This interesting example of a young Jewish woman who's an engineer telling them how it should be built. A reminder that many of the professional classes of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, were Jews. They would have had careers and lives, engineers, physicists, doctors, ended up working as slaves in camps like this. It's a terrifying scene, isn't it? You realise that anyone who ends up on this list may survive the war. Anyone who doesn't make the list is condemned immediately as the Nazis carried out their gigantic programme of genocide, of annihilation of an entire people.
Same thing I'm doing. You might even make money at it.
I don't know.
Come on, Julius. I know about the extra food and clothes you get them paid for out of your own pocket. If we make a combined approach, we could get more than 4,000 out, mine and yours. We could relocate them in something like safety in Moravia.
It's an important reminder that the Holocaust wasn't just about the murder of the Jews, it was about exploiting their labour, it was about barbaric employment practices. And on their way to those death chambers, they were expected to work and support German industries and munitions. And there were some industrialists, some companies did very well out of that.
I can't do anything more. I will not accept that. No.
Every survivor of the Holocaust I meet talks to you about that strange moment of luck, of chance, of fortune that saw them survive, them plucked out of the mass as their families, their friends, their communities were murdered. The film has a generous portrayal of Oskar Schindler. The fact is he was a Nazi, he was an industrialist, he was taking advantage of this Jewish labour, but he did save these people. And he did create a list. He created a list. It was found hidden in an attic, and Schindler had stashed it there just before his death in 1974. And we do know from earlier in the war there is evidence that Schindler was not an avowed Nazi. He did not believe in the destruction of every Jew from Europe. Itzhak Stern, the accountant, when he first meets him in 1939, he had said, "I'm a Jew, just so you know, I have to tell you I'm a Jew." And Schindler was like, "Nonsense, it doesn't matter." So it does appear that from the beginning, Schindler thought that the Nazi regime was going unimaginably too far in its ambition to destroy the Jewish people. Steven Spielberg had a very tough job here because he had to portray the horrors of the Holocaust, which he does absolutely brilliantly. But if he actually had shown just how bad it was, it would have been unwatchable. It would have been too terrible to put on screen. Camps like this would have been even worse than portrayed. And it was said that this particular camp, you could hardly look into the sky and avoid the number of corpses that were hanging by their necks from various high points around the camp. So in this clip, we see the terrible aftermath of the assault on Omaha. Bodies littered on the beach, discarded equipment, blood in the shallow water. And the camera focuses on Orion. He's a made-up character, very loosely based on a young man from the Nyland family, one of 4 boys fighting in the Second World War. And then we cut back to the United States, the War Department, where messages are being sent out to people, condolence messages, telling families that their loved ones have been killed.
Dear Mrs. Jensen, the untimely death of your son. No words of mine can ever relieve me. Our outfit has felt his loss tremendously.
He was a fine soldier, and he believed very strongly in what...
It's no secret anymore that we were involved in one of the most important...
Something like this did actually happen. 3 members of the Nyland family of New York were killed or declared missing in June 1944, 2 in the Normandy invasion, 1 in Burma. There was a 4th member of the Nyland family, and the American government decided to go and withdraw him, remove him from the Normandy battlefield. So this film's based loosely on the Nyland brothers. This bit's very moving, classic Spielberg, pulling on the heartstrings, an image of rural America, an idyll, a traditional house, woman in the kitchen, simple, honest, patriotic family, and that the car pulls up the dusty drive and the mother knows immediately what it is. It's a simple scene, but it's very powerful. Shocking that the news being brought is not just 1 son, but 3 have lost their lives.
All 4 of them were in the same company in the 29th Division, but we split them up after the Sullivan brothers died on the Juno.
Any contact with the 4th son, James?
No, sir.
And then senior American commanders make the decision to withdraw the last brother, to spare the family and perhaps also spare a terrible news story for the US military. So much of this scene is made up and there are inaccuracies here, but it's a stunning piece of filmmaking. And there are elements that are very accurate. One thing that is odd is that Tom Hanks' character would have been about 10 years younger than he is in this film. The age of these junior officers would have been in their 20s. You also see the devastation that had been rained down upon these villages and towns. There'd been a gigantic concentration of bombing of this area, both before and after D-Day. They would have been fighting house to house, room to room. There was brutal urban warfare.
Disperse, you know what to do. Rabbit, get on the rabbit.
And I think it's also true that in the days that followed D-Day, you had isolated groups of paratroopers, you had units that advanced inland that were often taking on powerful German counterattacks with light weaponry, with rifles, bazookas, machine guns, against armour. As the Germans desperately threw heavy forces into the battle to try and push the Allies back into the sea. The actors went through training on 1940s equipment, weapons, kit. You can see their familiarity with these objects, their movements are so fluid. In fighting in a built-up area like this, Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs are very effective. Tanks haven't got much room to maneuver, and you can trap them, cut them off, and try and destroy them by hitting vulnerable parts of the tank. You can see the German infantry kind of closely operating with tanks. They would ride on the tanks, they'd try and use the tanks as cover against small arms fire. That's probably pretty accurate. And it must have been terrifying in Normandy when isolated groups of infantry, paratroopers found themselves attacked by German armour. The weapons you've got simply aren't able to penetrate those hulls. You're very, very vulnerable indeed. You probably wouldn't keep a sniper like that in a church tower for a long time, because after the first few kills it becomes very clear where he is. They would actually try and move around a bit more rather than just be isolated in a church spire, even though that's what we often think. The odd thing about Saving Private Ryan is that for a film that spends a lot of time talking about historical accuracy, the battle at the end is made up. It's quite inaccurate. So the Battle of Rommel that's being shown here didn't take place. There isn't a place called Rommel. It's fictional. And it was shot in a disused airfield in Hatfield in England. But it is sort of very loosely based on a battle that did take place just after D-Day. One of the many battles, the intense fighting that took place after D-Day on the 9th of June. The 82nd Airborne and 101st took on the German 91st Division that was trying to counterattack, trying to push the Allies back into the sea. And that battle was fought in Saint-Mary-Église, a place where the paratroopers had landed and clung onto despite repeated German counterattacks. The German troops you see attacking here is SS Das Reich, which was an elite German unit, but actually it wasn't in Normandy yet. It was in the south of France, or it was in central France, and it was slowly moving across France to try and take on the Allies, but being hampered by railways being blown up by resistance fighters and intense air bombardment. I can see why this has been chosen as one of the all-time great history movies. Nothing had ever portrayed the Second World War like this movie portrayed the war. Its attention to detail, its use of special effects, working with veterans to try and recreate what that battlefield sounded like, looked like, felt like. It was incredibly shocking for audiences when this film was released. And I think it still gives us one of the greatest ever portrayals of combat in the history of cinema.